Hello everyone, this is Bhargav Reddy joining you from Bangalore, India. I'm the Regional Operations Director for APAC Assistance. Today we have with us our Founding Director, Paul Quaglia. We'll be discussing today about the COVID-19 response and recovery across the Asia-Pacific region. Now, there has been a lot of talk about what will happen or how it will unfold once the lockdowns will come down and we are on the path to recovery, especially from an economic perspective. So to enlighten us a little more about the path to recovery, we'll be going through a few possibly controversial topics, especially centered around China. Now, Paul, if I may pick your brains on this, China's response has been talked about quite a lot in the media of recent. In fact, China's response has been compared with some of the other countries who have successfully controlled the spread of the COVID-19 virus within their territories. But some of the bigger countries like the US, India, Indonesia, seem to be clueless as far as the spread is concerned, the kind of measures they are taking. They seem to be shooting in the dark. So how would you assess China's response in comparison to the big countries like USA and some of the countries in Europe as well, especially the UK?
Well, it's very interesting because pre-COVID-19, there was a continuing assumption that the UK and the USA governments, their governance, their public policies, the maturity of their organisations was such that they could handle everything well. Now, that's clearly not been the case. Just overnight, the UK's on the Isle of Wight's been trying to develop a COVID-19 app, and they've given it away and said that they're going to have Google and Apple, or I beg your pardon, Android and Apple provide that service for them. Well, they're several months into it. The Australian government has one, the Singaporean government has one, Taiwan government has one, Korean government has one, the Japanese government has one, the UK are fluffing around like they have in getting personal protection equipment to their frontline workers. But by really stark contrast, and rather than me talk about my own feelings, which are very strong, I'd like to quote The Guardian. And The Guardian quoted a survey that was done by a German polling firm, Dahlia Research, and that is headed by the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Now, they did a survey polling, 100,000 odd plus people, and asked participants from 53 countries whether they thought the US or China has handled the coronavirus better. Now, it's no prizes that only 3 countries did not think that China had handled it better. And those 3 countries are Taiwan, South Korea, and the USA. So here we have a really credible international poll asking a very simple question, and 50 of 53 countries stated China thinks it handled it better. Now, if we look at, the number of fatalities in America, the cases in America, the lack of cohesion between the states and the nation, and the lack of science in the decision-making, being overridden by political decision-making by the Trump administration, it's clear who has handled this better. And then you have a small group of America and the Five Eyes setting up a little clique to try and throw blame. Now, ironically, one of the key partners in that Five Eyes ally group is Australia. And domestically, we can see how easy it can be to win support. You don't have to do much well as a government in crisis. Australia has between 80 and 90% of approval from Australians thinking their government's done well. And indeed, in a poll conducted also by The Guardian, the Prime Minister enjoys 89.3% of opposition voters support his decision-making. I personally think it was fairly solid, but not great. They failed in Australia. They failed to sequence their decision making. So they would declare lockdowns, but then they would have a 2-week pause while they thought about how they would manage the economic fallout of massive unemployment. So I believe, and I think it's supported by the German Poldalia research, that China has done a much better job in locking down Wuhan and now locking down areas of Beijing. But most critically, to handle COVID-19, you have to have very good contact tracing. And you can only have contact tracing if you lock down and isolate to enable your government to then contact trace those that may be affected. When you are allowing people to go to political rallies or demonstrating about Black Lives Matter or opening up the economy prematurely, you're fundamentally not only handling it well, you're losing control. And it's clear that China has got control. And I might even go as far as to say that neoliberalism may well find itself to be as challenged from within, particularly in countries like the UK and the USA, because of the abysmal performance on COVID-19, and find their ideologies challenged from within as much as communism and autocracy are challenged by the West. So look, there's some fairly strong comments by me, but I think one of the great problems that America in particular, and to a lesser degree the UK is finding, is that their partisan politics prevents free thought, critical thinking and objective assessment. So what used to be the great countries in modifying their behaviours has become extremely staved in their approaches, and they're starting to believe their own hype. And when countries believe their own hype, their own propaganda and their own falsehoods, we're likely to see a continuing ascendancy of China, and we're seeing that economically already. So, Bug, I have a long-winded answer, but please feel free to ask me further questions.
Well, how would you respond to the critics that the inadvertent advantage of China is that they are autocratic? They rule with a heavy hand, and that has actually helped them in such an extreme situation. On the other hand, the liberal, the democratic approach of the West has actually let them down in such emergencies. So would you say that the liberal form of governance isn't really compatible in such situations?
Look, as a chap that was, an operations major in the military and having held roles in crisis management in organisations, massive mines in Indonesia, gas companies, various corporations, whilst I was vested in international SOS and with organisations like the World Bank, there is no doubt that a fundamental principle of successful crisis management is clear decision making. It can't be a discussion. It needs to have predefined authorities, but above all, it needs to have accountability. And I think one of the big problems in the UK and in America's handling of the COVID-19 has been a lack of control, too much ambiguity, too much power for politicians that don't have accountability, and as such, they don't have to stand by science and justify decisions because they know they can manipulate the media. So China is certainly, and not only China, but countries with good civil obedience, not even autocracies. Singapore, for example, has confined its cases to worker dormitories where they have a lot of cases, but community cases are very low, currently between 3 to 7 a day. And because they have very well-defined and controlled lockdowns supported with digital apps, supported by a highly efficient public service doing contact tracing, countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan and Singapore are excelling, as is China. It's just not in the best interests of the Western media to acknowledge that. Nobody likes to acknowledge their own failures. But we also have to look at this and see that whilst China is ascending, not only in terms of GDP, and since the year 2014, China is the biggest economy on a purchase power parity basis. And by 2024, it will be 56% bigger than the American economy on a purchasing power parity basis. But China is basically, whilst it's being very belligerent against the countries that are speaking out against it, and possibly with good reason, because there's a lot of poorly defined accusations. And on the back of Huawei and these issues, a lot of accusations are fair against China, the South China Sea, for instance, but others are going to prove to have been politically based. So in short, the command and control that China has and the civil obedience that Japan and Taiwan and Singapore has means that they've been able to address COVID-19 internally a lot better. And one can't but help to think that a lot of the slinging going on is to help America portray a handling internally that just simply isn't. It isn't there. Its problem between national and state and its Republican Democratic divide is such that one feels that America started off wanting to upset Mexico and build a fence, but perhaps now if you went to the border, the Mexicans couldn't be building that fence quick enough. So Bhargav, I mean, that's a very pragmatic and blunt and unpopular opinion, but one that's based on having been assessing Asia since 1984. I think one of the great problems the Western world is facing now is that it's starting to only trust media sources that agree with it. So it's falling into let's research and find sources that agree with often myopic and extremely insular and very dangerous views, and that objectivity research, learning, lateral thought has fallen by the wayside, particularly in America, where everybody wants and needs America to be a powerful voice for democracy. But certainly the Trump draining of the swamp's been disappointing. He's become an even more toxic swamp than the swamp that he took over. And there were a lot of optimistic people internationally and domestically. But I think now people are seeing through the capabilities and the motives of the Trump administration. So again, I'm not aiming to be popular. I'm not aiming to be a conformist, but I'm not seeing this like particularly a lot of the regional and global analysts that are themselves falling for basing their opinion on Western opinion and media opinion rather than the data. And I think the West, whilst it portrays that the World Bank and IMF are global entities, they're fundamentally Western entities, but they do produce excellent data. I mean, they get a lot of well-paid, indeed overpaid people to produce that data, and that data is very solid, but people don't look at that data and base their analysis on it. They base their analysis on the media views that spin off from it, and that's a very clear distinction between the two processes there.
Well, it's very hard to disagree with you to a certain extent, because the US did have about 120,000 increasing deaths, while China has limited it to below 5,000. Now, the critics may argue that we don't really see the clear picture about China because you only see what they want you to see from the outside. So having said that, if we can move on to the next topic, let's say in terms of economic recovery, where do you think the multinationals will be heading to, especially in terms of supply chain diversification? There is an increased talk of over-dependency on China that has hit Western economies in such an outbreak period. So in the same context, do you see a greater deviation from China into other smaller countries in Southeast Asia or South Asia?
Look, I see on the short term a possible emotional reaction and countries moving some of their supply chain dependency out of China. Japan's allocated a large sum of money, in the billions of dollars, to encourage their companies to relocate to Southeast Asia. But I think we need to put it in the context that gives a more longer term view. And that is that China is fundamentally a part of Asia Pacific, and Asia Pacific is a massive region, not just geographically, not just in population, but importance to the world economy. And again, I refer to IMF data, International Monetary Fund data, and about now we're hitting a very important juncture in GDP analysis, and that is that the Asia Pacific region is now basically intersecting a trend line with the rest of the world's GDP, and talking, which I do on a PPP basis because it's a more fairer reflection on power than on a pure nominal basis. Asia is basically now already on a PPP basis larger than the world economy. And as the rest of the world, in comparison to Asia Pacific's economy, declines, Asia rises. Now, Southeast Asia and ASEAN, is an economic bloc, but it still pales into insignificance when we compare it to China. If we look on a GDP nominal basis, USA, is the number one economy with a USA GDP figure of $24 trillion. China's second with about 14.5 trillion. The reality, though, is we have to assess further than that. And I've already talked about in 2014, China moved into number one position on a purchasing parity basis. But what we also have to consider is that USA, to a large extent, is undermining itself as the superpower. It's withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's pulled out of the Paris Accord. It's pulled out of contributing to WHO. It's often dangerously trying to backtrack after emotional and ill-considered decisions. But America is also enforcing to not contribute to these multilateral treaties. It's also putting itself in a position where it's asking allies to support it with ideological based commentary, but then it's competing with countries, most recently Australia, by telling China to buy $20 billion more dollars from us this year. Well, then that puts America up against Australia in oil, in gas, in coal, in meat, in other agricultural products. So America's in moving away from fair trade agreements and potentially competing against its allies. It's not doing itself any favours. And I think you combine that with the partisanship evident in America and their historical issues internally and their safety and security issues and their problems with drugs, it's going to be harder for them to be a global voice piece on human rights and advocate democracy and neo-capitalism when their COVID-19 response has been poor. So to get back to your question, Bhargav, I see a short-term reaction, but the bottom line is China is such a massive economy and it's such a massive trading partner that ultimately countries like Australia in the region will, to a large degree, have to take a little bit of pressure from China, and will have to accept the fact that economic allies and security allies that have been traditional allies may not be standing next to you with the same vigour they used to be when they actually want to compete against you and not be part of forward-thinking multilateral and free trade agreements. So I think we're going to see on the long term the reality that countries must have strong economies. They must have jobs, they must have sound economics. And the fact that China is the largest economy on a PPP basis, and that it's going to be the largest economy on a nominal basis, there is going to be a shift and a challenge of traditional ideology. Asia Pacific, of course, is blessed with way more than half the world's population, with China having 1.4 billion, India 1.3 billion. Asia Pacific, in terms of economic power and population and social age population, is really a hemisphere in its own right, and it is competing and exceeding the rest of the world's economic value. So ultimately, China is going to have to look at its own ideology. It's going to have to look at its own transparency, because it's going to want to get companies, I beg your pardon, other countries on board. And if it continues to bully countries into accepting debt liabilities for the Belt and Road Initiative, it's going to learn that you can perhaps bully internally, but not externally. So I think China's going to have to learn to adapt how it communicates, and it's going to have to learn that without win-win, there's a loser. And when there's another loser, ultimately China will lose itself. So I think we're going to see a moderation of China's belligerent activities and expansionism, only because it will help itself to do so. But I think Western countries, particularly USA, we're going to see a change in government. We're going to see a more balanced and a return to some foresight. I think the days of a powerful, out of control State Department are over. Thank the Lord, whoever your Lord may be. But Trump's kind of the emergency America had to have, and they've now tried to have change. And I think that other political parties and large public services within America, not only the police with the Black Lives Matter movement, but the State Department itself, is going to be a swamp that's forever changed. Not fully drained, but certainly fully changed. So in short, China's going to continue to be the massive economic driver. Asia Pacific is indeed. That's an irrevocable trend. And sadly, I think America and the UK has been too much caught up in their own ideology, but in their own self-importance, that they've missed. And have, with the Huawei issue and other issues, they're trying to prevent China becoming a superpower when, guess what, it already is. So they're going to have to learn how to manage that. And that's also going to require incredible change internally. And I think the UK government and the American government, we're going to see a change in government because of the bad handling. But the real issues facing the global economy is that the top 20 countries dominate such a massive extent of economic wealth. 173 countries outside the top 20 economics make up less than a quarter of the total global economy. So these kinds of wealth disparities are not going to be managed effectively by world banks and IMFs. There's going to have to be a more fair, a more liberal view globally that considers everybody's perspective, not just their own. So China and USA are both going to be forced to change, in my view. And China's going to continue to be a critical part of the global economy, and that's not going to change because of COVID-19. Yes, on the short term, but the reality is countries must trade with such a massive superpower. Geographical proximity will drive that to a large degree, but also China will change for the better. And I have more confidence in that, unfortunately, than I do in USA changing for the better. I think the divide and the divisions driven by Trump and his administration are a sad reflection on the unhealthy partisanship in American politics and indeed in American culture and society.
Well, while talking about Chinese belligerence, it also boils down to ideology. In terms of ideology, I mean Chinese increasing despotism and autocracy towards Hong Kong, which has been a beacon or a gateway into the Chinese market, where Western companies used to land and trade freely, while Chinese companies also had a gateway to interact with the Western world. So there has been talk of the problems with putting all the eggs in one basket, that is manufacturing basket of China, right? So coupled with the growing autocracy and despotism, do you see businesses having to choose between despotic ideology versus the riches, what it may gain from doing business in China? Because after growing at such a humongous pace, China will end up being a consumer market from a producer market. So it is a very lucrative business for Western companies as well. So do you see companies, multinational companies from the West being divided along ideological and business lines?
I think we've got to extend something and overcome some misnomers here. Firstly, there's a tendency to think economies are driven by multinationals and to think that the market indicators indicate economic strength. And that's a Western-driven belief, and it's simply wrong. A majority of the economies do not show up in the market indices. So small and medium enterprises in nearly every economy globally, except the old state-run economies, particularly in the Stans. So the importance of small and medium enterprises and their agility will always mean that they will seek profit. So fundamentally, issues of autocracy or as you described, the despotic nature of China is one thing. But when we see America and UK professing the superiority of their ideology, or China professing the superiority of their ideology, now that China is open, it's a lot less relevant than it used to be, because small businesses, medium businesses can still do business with China. Now, I think the Hong Kong issue and indeed the Taiwan issue is very important to get your head around, because people are blinded by their own ideologies when they assess it. China leased land to the Brits because of its usefulness as a seaport, and indeed because of its usefulness as a gateway into China. Now that China's opened up, that gateway doesn't now need to be so narrow. So China, even today in the APAC Assistance East Asia Pacific Roundup, but we're assessing the security situation and the clearing of the security bill by China. The reality is Hong Kong is not a separate nation. The Brits and half of the Hong Kong citizens will have you believe it was a part of a different nation, and it is a part of a different nation. It's not. It was part of China. China leased it to Britain. Britain made a whole heap of rules on we're going to give it back, and China smilingly signed off on those agreements. The reality is the lease was up and it was coming back. So let's not for 1 minute think that this two systems, one nation thing is anything other than a beautiful byline developed by British politicians. The reality is Taiwan and Macau and the various other even more troubled sites such as Liga region, this is all part of China. And China has 1.4 billion people. It's elected a leader for life. It's got a very autocratic system, and that's not going to change. The reality is, though, it its size as an economic power and its location nestled between Europe and the Americas, and its proximity to the vast rest of that critical region, or the Asia Pacific hemisphere as I like to refer to it, is that businesses and smaller countries are always going to deal with China. And what's feeding that at the most is some horrendously failed policies coming out of Washington, DC. So if Biden wins the election, and if he can overcome some of the partisanship, and if he can start to address policies better, that may mean that countries go, you know what, our old ally, it's showing itself to be a great leader again, so we may look to trust it and maybe not engage as much with China as we need to be. But there's a lot of ifs there, and American political landscape, and indeed the inefficiencies of the way they go about passing policies and the way they have become very inconsistent in honouring multilateral agreements, and even bilateral agreements, means that China is inadvertently, not only through its own policies and its own planning, but just by the abysmal performance of the US administration, not only under Trump, by the way, but the lying to allies on weapons of mass destruction, means that China is going to be a lot more engaged with other countries and economies than the Western media and indeed American policymakers will have the rest of the world believe. So we're in for challenging times ahead, but China will continue to be a major driver, not only in Asia-Pacific economic affairs, but in the global economic affairs. And when it all boils down to it, economics is critical, because that feeds people. Human rights discussions do not.
Paul, if you were to look at other alternate countries where businesses may consider investing as opposed to China for various reasons, it could be because they saw the side effects of increased importance of one source for their supply, or it could be because of ideology or increased state control. Which other economies would you see as potential competitors in Southeast Asia, or even South Asia for that matter?
Yeah, so I'll restrict my answer there to Asia Pacific region, and there are options outside of this region. And one has to really drill in on the pros and cons of each of the alternatives, because you've got to consider legal stability, you've got to consider corruption, you've got to consider availability of infrastructure, you've got to look at the costs, which is of course always going to be critical. So I'll very quickly cover off on a few, but not all. I think from a cost perspective, India is a very good alternative. The problem is its cons are significant, and that's a lack of infrastructure, too much red tape, perceived belief by Indians that they must always win the negotiation. They don't have a culture of win-win, and they often provide a product or facilities that are so cheap that they're not acceptable to the rest of the world. Vietnam's very efficient. Cost is very attractive. Problem is it likes to bring people in behind closed doors and issue very unsavoury rules, and those rules are not necessarily going to pass the Sarbanes-Oxley test. Other countries within Southeast Asia, Indonesia is getting less red tape and more efficient for companies to invest, but it has a massive problem with corruption. It has a massive problem with the rule of law. It fails to separate courts with politics and government. It has a very easily manipulated and bought off judicial system. So Indonesia can be a very attractive alternative if you don't have to have a state partner. If you're in a business that doesn't need a state partner, then it can be an incredibly great place to invest, as long as your private partner is well vetted and well verified. And people make the mistake of seeing a smiley face in Indonesia and hearing yes can do and assuming that means yes can do. So it's understanding the cultural nuances. Though Thailand's not cost competitive, it has very good infrastructure. It has very good industrial sites. It has pretty good governance. And again, people think that there was a military coup and a military-run government. Yes, that's all true, but I would call that a necessary military intervention, because the government and the alternative government were so corrupted that the military had to take over. They don't want to be in there. They stated that, but in the end they couldn't keep out. Will they stay in too long? Hopefully not, but yes, probably they will. And ultimate power ultimately corrupts, as we all well know. But that doesn't just apply to other countries, it also applies to Western countries. So I think countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, they have a problem that they have bad infrastructure. They've had a long period of low levels of governance. So those traditional investment spots are pretty much going to remain in place, and that's Thailand and Vietnam. Another massive problem that Indonesia has is very antiquated laws that make agility for businesses difficult. If you have to lay off people, you simply can't. Unionism and oligopolies and bad elements of ministries in Indonesia and parliamentarians as such, that there are a lot of hidden tigers when doing business in Indonesia. So countries also like Singapore are just not going to be cost competitive. Multinationals that want to have a very simplistic footprint, banks that want good internet and good infrastructure, they'll continue to gravitate towards Singapore because that's what you get, but you just don't get, vast land tracts. You do not get access to labour. So I think they're the key economies in Asia Pacific. Obviously, of course, you can't rule out Australia and New Zealand that offer, world-class infrastructure, ease of doing business. Singapore offers the same, but Vietnam, Thailand are going to continue to be very attractive. And whilst Indian government's portraying themselves as such only for really low-skilled, factories requiring low skill, the textile industry, assembling vehicles, India, Bangladesh, even Sri Lanka will be attractive alternatives. But for companies demanding better infrastructure, more complex nature of a workforce, I think Southeast Asia is still an attractive alternative in line with those pros and cons that I've outlined, Bhargav.
Well, with that, I guess it boils down to businesses thinking clearly and looking through the maze of ideological debates and understanding prudently the costs and the benefits of doing business in each of these countries, rather than get lost in the ideological debates. And with that, thank you very much for joining us. That's all we have for today. So to get similar insightful assessments from our founding director or our team of analysts, you can contact us at iqueries@apacassistance.com or visit us at www.apacassistance.com. You can also avail our information services on a subscription basis. However, an in-depth analysis like you had today can only be tasked by our membership clients on any issue of concern. So to know more about these subscription services and membership services, you can always contact us. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bhargav. See you.